These are the 9.2 notes, sum and difference identities. This is page 6. So we've got a review at the top of the cofunction identities. Remember that pi over 2 is 90 degrees. So in any of these instances, we could replace that pi over 2 with 90 degrees. The sine of an angle equals the cosine of 90 minus that angle, so the cosine of the complement. And we looked at that briefly at the bottom of page 2. We reviewed or re-talked about cofunctions. And so now we're going to take a look at verifying some of these cofunctions using what we know about the sum and difference formulas. Okay. So exercise 8 is asking us to use the cosine of alpha minus beta, which equals cosine alpha cosine beta plus sine alpha sine beta, to find an equivalent expression for cosine pi over 2 minus theta. And so here's what I'm going to do. Just plug in. So if I need a reminder here, my alpha is pi over 2. My beta is theta. It's important that we keep track of the order because this is a subtraction. And so things would change if we mixed things up. So we have cosine of pi over 2 times the cosine of theta, that's a times, plus the sine of pi over 2 plus the sine of theta. Keep in mind we do not know what theta is, but we can evaluate cosine and sine at pi over 2. So the cosine at pi over 2 is 0. So I got 0 times cosine theta plus the sine at pi over 2 is 1. And so I get 0 times cosine theta is 0. 1 times sine theta is sine theta. So we have just shown that cosine of pi over 2 minus theta equals the sine of theta, which is what we have right up here in the very top left corner. Okay. So B, write sine of pi over 7 in terms of its cofunction. This is going back a couple of sections. Nothing more than sine of pi over 7 equals the cosine of its complement, so pi over 2 minus pi over 7. We need a common denominator before we can subtract those. 2 and 7 are relatively prime, which means we have to multiply them by each other to get 14 in the denominator. So I get 7 pi over 14 minus 2 pi over 14, which gives us the cosine of 5 pi over 14. And that is all this is asking. Write that in terms of its cofunction. Cosine and sine are cofunctions. Pi over 7 and 5 pi over 14 are complements. And that's it. At the bottom of the page, using sum and difference formulas to verify identities. We're going to get back into the proofy type stuff. Start by using the expression on the side of the equal sign that appears most complex. We did that in section 9.1. Keep in mind that sometimes you may see patterns that make it easier to work with one side versus the other. It may not always be the most complex side, but if you don't know where to start, that's the best place. Okay, we're going to rewrite that expression until it matches the other side of the equal sign. We definitely do not want to work with both sides. What tends to happen then is we start multiplying across both sides and then we are changing values. We don't want to do that. 2, look for opportunities to use sum and difference formulas now that you know them. Make sure that we can rewrite sum or difference quotients as a single quotient. We want to combine those fractions. And if the process becomes too cumbersome, we're going to do something here that I typically start with. We're going to rewrite in terms of sines and cosines, break it down to the basic pieces and go from there. And so this is it for page 6, on to page 7.